to today's edition of the Practitioner's Problem of Practice, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. I'm Chad.
I'm Rachel.
I'm Randy.
And today we have a guest with us, and her name is Lauren Belowich. Lauren, please say hello and share more about yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Belowich. I am a teacher at one of the high schools here locally. I've been teaching for 14 years, particularly in the area of math. And this year I am teaching Algebra 1.
So in each episode, we discuss a practitioner-based challenge through a human-centered lens. These conversations are intended to be grounded in the practical work that happens in our schools every day and to bring our compass points into focus around these questions. And Lauren, go ahead and share your question for this week.
Sure. One of the questions that I've been kind of focusing on revolves around equity and student achievement. So since the advent of the federal and the state strategies for holding school districts accountable for student achievement, it appears to me that the stakeholders and the policymakers are now attempting to reduce the disparity among different student groups. Those student groups such as students with learning disabilities, students with a lower socioeconomic status, minority students, and historically underperforming students. However, there's an expectation that all students will achieve at their grade level, regardless of the student group. And it doesn't necessarily decrease that gap, it increases it. The problem that I've seen is that all students need to achieve at the same level, but the problem of practice is that there are actually different expectations for different students.
Okay, so we've got a good meaty problem of practice to discuss, which is around expectations. And the one thing I'll start with, and then someone else jump in, is even the language of subgroup populations of students identified as economically disadvantaged or defined as historically underperforming, I would say are really dehumanizing language. So there's like that part of it. I know that's not really what we're attacking with this conversation, but I just always find that problematic that we define kids with those kinds of labels. So, any one of you jump in here with some thoughts.
So I guess my first thought would be around differentiation. I know teachers that I've worked with, differentiation often feels this massive thing that you build a test and then you have to build X number of versions of the test. Would you feel like that's what you're seeing as well?
For me, it's differentiation, yes, but we're really this year starting to talk more about personalization. To me, differentiation means you're teaching the same content at different levels. And then personalization is when you are basically teaching the student at their level, whatever the content may be. And while I completely am on board with that, scope, it's very difficult as a classroom teacher to teach 30 different students different things. So I think that, one of the things with achievement and growth, there's always a juxtaposition between the two, but to me, growth is achievement and achievement is growth. And, part of the standardized tests that the kids take, the growth isn't necessarily reflected in their score. They see, did I pass or did I fail? And sometimes it's not all about that, especially for the student groups that we're talking about.
When you spoke with us before, you used a really great metaphor around what equity looks like for your students. Do you remember what that was?
Sure.
Yeah.
So my metaphor was that my students were running a race. I kind of tie everything all the ways back to athletics because that's just my background. But my students are running a race. If there's a student that is not part of a subgroup, they're basically just running a sprint. And they start the race and they end the race and there's no problem. And like maybe their shoe's untied, but it's okay. They get through it. But, when students become part of the subgroups that, have been identified, which is kind of the first step in the right direction, maybe they're not running just the race. Maybe a student with disabilities is running hurdles instead of a sprint. Or if they're part of another subgroup, maybe they're running with their hands tied behind their back as well. So the introduction of the different subgroups makes more obstacles for those students, which kind of ties into the fact that there are different expectations for different students to succeed.
So one of the things that's resonating with me here is that we have this paradox. We want, on one end, we want to personalize things, and on the other end, we want to standardize things. It's like, how do those two things coexist? So we're in this really weird time, I think, in education. Good thing is, I think it shows some movement and shift in thinking, slow and glacial, albeit. But I think we still need to continue to be curious about, like, how do we can't have both. they can't really coexist together. And I think you've sort of explained sort of the conundrum around that. So I think that one of the ways that we can maybe accelerate that, and this is more of a curiosity, is how do we also tell the stories that are behind the standardization pieces? So when those kids are still required to meet the same expectations, is that the only story that we're telling? Is the only story that we're telling that they didn't meet the expectations because they got this on their particular standardized test? Or do we say, yes, they didn't meet the expectations, but here is all the other stuff that they did achieve that is personalized, that shows their human beingness, their humanness, and how do we have that be part of that story that's told around the performance of that student or the outcomes that they've achieved?
And to stick with that metaphor, I was a shot putter and a disc thrower and a jav thrower in high school. If you were measuring me and my ability to run 100 meters, in a competition with others, I would not have done as well. And so if we stick with that metaphor, like, some kids are running track, some kids are throwers, some kids are jumpers, some kids are playing baseball, some kids are in the jazz band. Like, again, I'm in staying with that metaphor, that this idea that all kids have to run that 100-meter race is also highly problematic. Now, I realize that that's maybe an unpopular thing, that, we want to make sure that kids have a basic level of competency. But to Randy's point, all learners are unique and capable and have their strengths. And so, how critical is it that this one test, this one measure defines their success, our success, what success looks like? Again, we don't have a lot of impact on policy making, at the local level when it comes to those kinds of things. But I just want to object and draw out that, why does every kid have to run that particular race? If a kid, has an area that they have some disability, and is there another way for them to show competency, to show their learning, that's not a race with extra hurdles and, what is it? Steeplechase, where you got to, like, dive over the water and, and everything like that. So I love that metaphor.
Or here's a race they're good at.
Mm-hmm.
Let's tell that story too, alongside the race that they're not so good at, just because we have to tell that story.
One of the things I'm wondering about, just kind of as a conversation piece is, if we bring it back down into the classroom level, and Lauren, you talked about, kind of personalizing. There's kind of two ways of personalizing. There's like personalizing teacher-led instruction, which oftentimes looks like software, which, again, not completely like bad or wrong. We're not placing any value judgment on it, so I don't want to be that way. And then there's students kind of personalizing their decisions around where they're at and how they get there. I also think there's a conversation that we probably didn't have, which is, it's not just that kids have to run the race, it's that they all have to run the race on the same day. And that could also be part of the problem. Is it's not that we're not saying that kids can't show competency, but it's that we've defined that on May 3rd, every kid has to show that competence. And does every person learn at the same rate, the same pace, same speed, things like that?
I've seen that. I teach struggling learners, primarily. Basically, it's a very open-ended amount of time that we use in class, because I myself was a struggling learner as a child. I almost failed math in 7th grade, and all of a sudden it just kind of clicked. And if I didn't have that more time with the subject to just learn the patterns and learn, if I do this, then this is going to happen, then I would have been in the same boat. And I think that, having the patience to allow the kids that time, it actually gives them more agency to want to succeed. So, yes, time I think is a huge factor. That's what I like kind of about our state, is that if you don't pass that standardized test the first time, you do get another opportunity and another opportunity after that, and as many as you need. So I do think that time is a huge factor, and that could be the equalizer, to be honest.
I think too about like universal design for learning, and how often we make assumptions that students in a given category can or cannot do something, right? That we almost standardize once they're labeled, right? The honors student, the AP student, the historically disadvantaged, the economically disadvantaged, that we make assumptions about them based on their identity. And I think similarly with universal design for learning, we assume that students, or I guess that it's in reaction to the assumption of, oh, well, I have to create a different version of something for this student. When in reality, some of the stuff that we do as educators actually might be great for everybody. And so if we start, when we design, by looking at everyone and seeing, okay, these kinds of learners need this, is that still beneficial for everybody? So for me, like, I was not a struggling learner. I was, I don't know, gifted in honors and AP, whatever. So I succeeded at school. But I can tell you that listening to directions versus reading them, I have a way better time if I get both. If they're written down versus if I'm just listening to someone explain something, I need both in front of me, right? So that's an advantage, or that works for me. Regardless, I wouldn't have fit into any of those boxes. So are there places where we're making assumptions? And then you have students who are economically disadvantaged who don't need those things too, that just because they fit there doesn't mean that they're actually struggling as well. So thinking about the labels that we have and the assumptions that we're making about the boxes that kids are put in, and how we can design with them for what works for them, but also recognizing that whatever box they've been placed in doesn't necessarily mean that everything ascribed to that box is true for them.
So as we wrap up here, I'm wondering if anybody has any curiosities or wonderings or questions that the conversation has sparked, moving forward. Again, we always talk about how, good conversation lead to more questions. So I'm wondering if anybody has one that kind of emerged.
I keep going back to this idea of story. And Lauren just shared a piece of her story that she was a struggling math educator too. So how do we sort of combat this challenge of labels and standardization and dehumanization by continuing to tell our students our own stories? That, stories are inspiring to people. Oftentimes it's hit or miss, but they can be inspiring. And I think that personal story of like, yeah, I was a struggling math student too. So I know how you're feeling. Like, I don't know if you have that chance at that opportunity to tell them that, but I just keep going back to story lately.
Yeah. Oh, I tell lots of stories, and sometimes to the point where they're like, okay, can we just get on with it now? But I
awesome.
think it brings that extra layer of engagement to the classroom. And, a lot of the time they will then kind of focus a little better if they're like, okay, well, I know that if I don't understand it right now, that's okay. It doesn't mean I'll never understand it. And that's great, because that's the exact point that I'm trying to get across to them, because that, transcends more than just math class. They're going to find a struggle in their life and need to persevere.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because I connected to Lauren's kind of story as well, in that I loved math while also not feeling very good at math, if that makes sense. And I always felt that if math had been taught through narrative as a language, for me, as opposed to the way that it was often taught through kind of like a rigid structured presentation, with rules, that I might have been more successful. But again, my point in this is that I always found that the story, the problem solving that came through it, even not feeling very talented at it, I still really enjoyed the puzzle of mathematics. And so my curiosity is around how kids access how they access mathematics or any subject through the variety of ways. So it's not just differentiating instruction, but differentiating the access points. So,
and then I was going to say, sorry, one more thing was just around how we can create space for students to then share their stories too. That what, as learners, how do we struggle, but how do we do well? And then what do we need? So not just our own as educators, but theirs too.
Well, I would like to thank Lauren for joining us today, and thank all of you out there for learning alongside us for this edition of the Human Schools Practitioner's Problem of Practice. If you have a problem of practice or a question that you'd like us to consider, or even come and discuss with us, please ask it in our community Facebook group or on social media. Visit thehuman.school and its Learning and Public Hub for additional resources, and join our conversation committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. Thanks so much, Lauren. We loved having you, and bye everyone for now.
Woohoo! Thanks, Lauren. Bye-bye.